to go ahead and get started today. Welcome everyone to the public training, the NEMSIS TAC for June 2024. Today we're going to be talking about the correlation ID. What does it do? How is it involved in the NEMSIS standard? And your presenters today are myself, Jennifer Correa. I'm a business data analyst here at the NEMSIS TAC. And we also have Josh Legler, our consultant. Josh, do you want to take a second and introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm an EMS data consultant. One of my contracts is with the NEMSIS TAC. Happy to be here today.
And I am very happy that he is here today as well. He is the consultant who I consider the expert in XML, the XML standard, and all the pieces and parts that go into it to making it work. And one of those things is the correlation ID. So we're going to go ahead and start with the first slide. What we plan on doing today is learning about the correlation ID. What does it do? How does it work? Why is it needed? And then at the end, we're also going to talk about the difference between the correlation ID and the UUID, which there's oftentimes confusion between those two. So we're going to try and clear that up for you today. If you have any questions, please feel free to put it into the chat. We would love to be able to interact with you and answer your questions. And if you have that question, I am sure someone else on the training has the question as well. So please don't be bashful and go ahead and use the chat. All right. So we're going to start with a brief introduction to XML, XSD, and schematron, what they are and the difference between them. So XML is the extensible markup language. That's the file type. Right? So when you send in an ePCR, you're sending it in XML format when it's transmitted from one system to another. The XSD is the XML schema definition that defines the structure that an XML file must adhere to pass. So basically that's telling you these are the requirements. This is the minimum requirement that you must meet in every single file. The schematron, that defines additional rules in addition to the XSD, right? So in the XSD, it says this is the minimum you have to have. You must have these things. The schematron allows you a little bit more flexibility. So it says you must have these things, or that's where your if-then statements, right? So if you are in an MVC, then your schematron validation rule would require you to also have the safety equipment that was used or the position of the patient in the vehicle at the time of the accident. That's how a schematron and an XSD are very different. Then there's the EMS data set or a DEM data set XML file. That is what's created and transmitted when the agency demographic data or EMS event data are generated. So your collect and send system will create that ePCR or create that demographic file, and it will send it to a receive and process system. And those are in the XML format. So those are pretty much the technical concepts that need to be, aware of in order to follow the rest of the conversation. So the first question we have is, why do we need a correlation ID? Well, it keeps track of things that are related to each other, right, within an XML file that are not necessarily put together. So a correlation ID can tie two groups of information together, or it can tie your custom element into the standard XML standard file, right? Sometimes a correlation ID is needed when adding a data element, extending an existing NEMSIS element with additional choices, creating a correlated group of custom data elements. And then as an example, there's an e-airway confirmation group within the standard that has to be tied back to the procedure it belongs to. A correlation ID is needed for that, right? So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about tying two groups of information together. So when we're talking about adding a data element, we're kind of talking about the custom elements. So if your state or your local oversight agency has added a custom element and that is not collected at the national level, you have to tie that custom element back to a national value. And we're going to show you examples of this later on But that's how correlation ID is used, right? It's going to show you what the custom element value was and what the NEMSIS element value is. You need that when you're extending a NEMSIS element, when you're just adding values to it. So hopefully by the end of this, you're going to see examples of all of that and understand when and where those would be needed. So what is a correlation ID? The correlation ID is an attribute, right? So the correlation ID is it's a tag or a label that's placed within that element in the XML. So this isn't something that you're going to see in your ePCR system. Usually, you're not going to see it there. It's going to be something that's kind of in the background. It's in that XML file itself. And the correlation ID helps us understand how these different parts are going to be connected, how they're going to work together. The link between a custom value and the existing data element, right? So what are you tying it back to? What are you going to report to that national data repository when your state system is collecting a custom element or a custom value? The link between custom elements can be within repeating groups, right? So let's say they've extended the eVitals section, such as the national custom element that was developed for the RAS scale, right? You could have multiple RAS scales performed. So you have to know which set of vitals that's going to, which set of vitals it belongs to. And that correlation ID is going to tie those things back together through that special tag or label. And then again, the link between the related elements, and I'm going to go back to that airway confirmation and the procedure. So it's going to tie those two things together. And how does a correlation ID work? So this was the hardest part for me to grasp when I was learning about correlation IDs. So each piece of data is given a unique identifier. That's the correlation ID, right? And sometimes the group or the element is repeating and the unique identifier is also listed in the e-custom results section. And for me, when I was learning this, that was where I was kind of like, wait, huh, what? So basically, when you have a correlation ID, it's always going to show up where that piece of data is given that unique identifier, and it will most usually show up in the e-custom results section, but not always, right? And so that starts to get confusing. This is where you have to start going, okay, well, where does it belong? So for me, I'm a real visual learner. Most people like to see examples. So I wanted to know, where do I find the correlation ID? And then people started talking about childs and descendants and ancestors. And so I made a picture of it so I could keep it straight in my head. The child or the descendant, that's going to be the group that it might belong to, right? So if we are extending the abdomen assessment, this is the child or descendant. And this is where Josh's expertise has been invaluable. And I have asked him many, many questions because he has helped me to understand that the correlation ID is going to belong to the group that it's extending, right? And so if the group here is being extended, but it's this assessment that had a value added, the correlation ID is going to be on the abdomen assessment where the value was added, right? But if it's the abdomen group that was extended, the correlation ID would be here. And when you're looking at the data dictionary, a real helpful hint are these C's right here, right? That's going to tell you a correlation ID really could belong right here, really could show up right here as you're starting to look at things. All right, and now let's look at some examples because I am sure I have lost about half of the folks on the call because this is where I got confused. So the first thing we're going to do is in addition to the patient demographics, the e-custom results 03 will not be present because the e-patient elements only occur once within an ePCR, right? So you kind of look over here and you see that the recurrence is one time for this group. And you know that somewhere in here, we're going to add something. So it could only possibly exist in that one place, that one time that it's going to show up in the XML. So this is what an XML looks like. And note the highlighted parts. So that's where I'm showing you that they're correlated, right? So in your XML file, this was configured, and it tells you this custom element is extending patient.01, right? That's where it belongs. It belongs in this group. And when you look at the results, because it only shows up once in an XML, there's no need for a correlation ID down here, right? So you might have a correlation ID in them. And this is the fun part. And I do apologize. I keep drinking water. E-dispatch 01 is the dispatch reason. E-customs 03 is not going to be present in the custom results. E-dispatch 01 only occurs once. And this is a mandatory field, right? So it has to be present in your XSD. And again, I'm going to show you what it looks like. And this is extending a custom value within a non-repeating group. E-dispatch 01, let's say somebody really wanted to, please don't do this, don't take this as a suggestion. E-dispatch 01, somebody really wanted to add nausea and vomiting in one line item. They set it up and they configured it to have a code value of 2301093, which refers back to the NEMSIS code 2301051. And if you know, that's no other appropriate choice in your E-dispatch 01. And they had the custom element ID set up as E-dispatch 901. And this is important because all of this information, believe it or not, is right in here. It shows up in your XML. This tells them everything it needs to know. The XML file will show the NEMSIS tieback value. And notice there's no correlation ID, right? It's going to show the NEMSIS tieback value. And it's going to show the custom value. And it's going to say this belongs to this custom element that you created in your system. I just wanted to check the chats just in case anything came up. All right. So the next value, the next example that we're going to show is E protocols 01. So this can occur multiple times, right? There's your M right there that shows many. So your group can show up many times. It occurs within multiple times within its parent element. And again, remember we talked about ancestors, parents, and children. And so this is the parent element right here. E-customs results 03 will have that correlation ID. So that is going to show up in your XML. And we're going to take a look at that. There we go. So extending the custom value within a repeating group, that's what this is called. We added the value for environmental heat-related injury. Again, these are not, we're not making recommendations for this custom value. We added the value of 9914299. And when we set the value up, we set it up in the state data set, we set it up in the demographic data set, and we set it up in the EMS data set, right? And so in those custom configuration sections, we said this custom value has a value of 9914299. And it ties back to the NEMSIS value 9914029 for environmental heat stroke or hyperthermia. The EMS XML file is going to contain the correlation ID and the e-custom results. So right here, you can see that within this ePCR, 3 different protocols were used. But only one of them was marked for the heat-related injury. Only one of them is a custom value that extended that element. So it gets this correlation ID right here, and you can see it highlighted in yellow. And then in the e-custom results section of the XML for the ePCR, it says, hey, on that group, we want it to have this custom value. And that's how it's tied together with this correlation ID. All right. So it can happen again. the E-vitals vital group. And you can see here that this has a lot of different places where a correlation ID could show up. So we use the RAS score, which is our newest national custom element that was created and added to our national custom element library. And you can see that there can be multiple groups of vitals taken, right? You can have one set of vitals to 20 set of vitals if you have a long distance interfacility transport. So it's really important to know where and when the RAS score was done. And the way that's handled is through the correlation ID process. So here you can see that there were two sets of vitals taken, one here at 10:04 and 30 seconds, and one here at 11 and 21 seconds. The correlation ID indicates that the RAS score belongs to the vitals group that was done at 10:04, right? And you can see that you've got the correlation ID 123, correlation ID 123 here in the e-custom results section, right? With the values, it says, hey, it belongs to the e-vitals 901, and the score was 3. That was the total score that was given there. But what happens if there's more than one RAS score done in a PCR, right? So you get different correlation IDs, a unique identifier for every set of vitals that was done that had a RAS score in it. So right here, you can see at 10:04, it had core ID 123. So that belongs here with a score of 3. And then at 11, core ID 456. And that had a score of -1. And that's how the correlation ID works. That's its purpose within the NEMSIS standard. And all right, doing good on, there's no questions, no comments, no chats or anything. Either I'm explaining it perfectly well or I've lost everyone. All right, so now let's talk about the one that's within the NEMSIS standard for the airway confirmations group. This is important because anytime that you do an advanced airway, you may have an airway confirmation group, right? And this allows an attribute called the procedure group correlation ID. And you can see that in the NEMSIS standard in the data dictionary. It's right there. And the procedure group correlation ID, this is the XSD. This is a picture of the XSD that you're seeing. If you go onto the NEMSIS website, anybody can look at our XSD. And this just lets you know that that's where that correlation ID is always going to be, right? It's always going to be there.
And Jen, I want to jump in with a distinction there.
Yeah.
The data dictionary has that visual indicator, the C in the yellow box, to indicate any elements that have a correlation ID attribute on them. So that's helpful. It shows us that airway confirmation group can have a correlation ID. You can have custom element data that extends the airway confirmation group. However, what the data dictionary does not visually show you is that the airway confirmation group has a second attribute. That attribute is called procedure group correlation ID. And that's what allows an airway confirmation to be tied back to a procedure that was done that was establishing an airway. In the next NEMSIS standard update for 3.5.1, the data dictionary pages are going to be improved in this regard, and you will see a yellow box or some colored box next to the box with the C that will indicate that that airway confirmation group has that second attribute, the procedure group correlation ID. So distinguishing between the two here, the correlation ID on the airway confirmation group allows you to tie some custom data that extends the airway confirmation group and tie that custom data back to that confirmation. But the procedure group correlation ID attribute on that airway confirmation allows you to tie that airway confirmation back to the original procedure where the airway was established.
So what you're saying is the correlation ID that's showing here, that's talking about the the confirmation group. It could be any custom element that a state or local jurisdiction would have added. The procedure group correlation ID doesn't show in the data dictionary yet. It will in 3.5.1, but that's the correlation ID we're going to show an example of here shortly.
That's
Okay.
right.
Thank you very much. All right, so multiple airway confirmations can reference the same airway procedure, right? So you have intubation rechecks, you have where you're looking at the same airway, right, multiple times to make sure that it's staying in place during transport. And this is an excellent example of that in place. So the procedure here was done at 1828, and that has a correlation ID of P1. And this procedure at 1009, correlation ID of P2. Right, and then you go down to your airway confirmation group, and this is an example of what Josh was talking about, right? There could be a correlation ID that is extending that group for something else. And then this correlation ID that's talking about the procedure group itself that is referencing the airway. So this shows both of them in and how it would look within the XML.
Right. So both of these airway confirmations are pointing back to that second procedure that had the correlation ID of P2. So both of these airway confirmations were confirming that particular, I think it was a supraglottic airway insertion, if I remember right. And then you could have custom data that extends the airway confirmations, like you had some additional, confirmation type or something. If you had that, it would be down in the custom element data, and it would have A1 or A2, pointing back to one of those two airway confirmation groups.
Sorry. So that is the correlation IDs. That's the next part that we're going to talk about is the correlation IDs versus the UUIDs. Are there any questions that are specific to the correlation IDs themselves? So Lauren, your question was, this shows up in the e-custom results section as well. Yes, the e-custom results would show the P2. Correct, Josh?
No, this is tying the airway confirmation to the procedure. So this is completely independent of any custom result data you might have. This is how you tie that airway confirmation back to the original procedure that was done.
So Lauren, no would be the answer to that. So the P2 is not going to show up in your e-custom results section. And then Sundown has a question. Do elements that may have a correlation ID always have the one-to-many property?
That's correct. Exactly correct. So any element that can have multiple occurrences in the XML, by definition, it has a correlation ID attribute. Any element that can only occur once in the XML will never have a correlation ID attribute.
Those were great questions. Are there other questions that that people would like to ask? Okay, and then again, at any time, if you have a question that comes up later, or you're rewatching this and you want to ask some questions, please reach out. You can reach out through the help desk. You can reach out to myself and we will get those answers for you. So the next portion of the call, we're going to talk about the UUID versus the correlation ID and how they differ. And I'm going to turn this over completely to Josh. And Josh, you let me know when you want to go to the next slide and I will be happy to switch it.
Okay, thanks, Jen. So really this training is about the correlation ID and not about the UUID, but we want to take a minute to distinguish and differentiate between correlation ID and UUID so that you'll know how the two are different from each other. The UUID, or Universally Unique Identifier, was added in NEMSIS 3.5. The correlation ID has existed all the way back to the beginning of NEMSIS 3. The UUID was added to identify resources within repeating groups in the demographic data, and then also to identify resources to identify patient care reports. The purpose of the UUID is to identify a data object that represents some real world thing that persists over time. So if we take the example of an agency's vehicle, an agency purchases a vehicle, they go into their EPCR system and they set up some information about that vehicle. And so their EPCR system now has a data object in it that represents the information about that actual vehicle that they have sitting in the ambulance bay. As they make changes to that vehicle information over time, they may change its call sign, its vehicle number, its vehicle type. I mean, they could change any of the information about that vehicle. And when data gets sent from their EPCR system to some other system, like a state system, it can be very difficult for that state system to recognize that this was actually one particular vehicle's data object that they were changing over time, changing its vehicle number and things like that. So what happens with the UUID is that it's generated at the time that the agency sets up the data object that represents that vehicle. And then no matter what changes they make to that data object, that UUID stays the same throughout all the time that that vehicle exists in that agency. Every time that agency sends data to the state, the demographic data, then the state system gets the UUID for that vehicle record, and it understands, okay, it's this vehicle that I need to update in my own database. Even though the vehicle number changed, the unit call sign, everything changed about it, but I still know that it's the same vehicle object because it has the same UUID as what they submitted a month ago or a year ago when they first created that vehicle. So that UUID stays consistent over time for that real world data object. And the same thing happens with patient care reports. No matter even if you change the patient care report number or the incident number or anything else, that patient care report has a UUID that it uniquely identifies that data record within the database of your EPCR system. So that's how UUID works, and it has a different purpose than Correlation ID. The purpose of Correlation ID is to just connect custom element data or airway conformations to an existing data element within a single data file that's being submitted within that document. The UUID, the purpose of the UUID is to be persistent across time, representing real world data objects that change over time. And that UUID has to stay the same every time the data gets generated, for years and years. So with Correlation ID, because it's just scoped to be within that very document that you're looking at, like that patient care report, the correlation IDs that get generated, they can be different every time the file is generated. It doesn't matter because all it needs to do is allow some custom result data to be tied to a particular instance of a data element that's in that XML file. So as long as both spots have the same value as each other, it doesn't matter what that value is. And it doesn't matter that that value is different every time you generate the file. Just as long as they match up with each other, then the receiving system knows this custom element data is overriding this particular instance of a data element in the file. The UUID, on the other hand, has to stay the same every time a file is generated to identify that real world data object. The correlation ID can be any value that's a string. So numbers, letters, dashes, whatever. It just needs to be the same in both places. The correlation ID on the element, and then customresults.03 needs to have that right value. As long as there's a match, we're good. The UUID, on the other hand, has to comply with the UUID specification, which is a hexadecimal number that gets generated using a particular algorithm to guarantee uniqueness universally across all time, that the same value will never be generated twice, all of that. So specific requirements around the UUID. When we were when we were adding the UUID to NEMSIS, to the NEMSIS standard, we had discussion about what to do about the correlation ID. And we said, you know, does it make sense for places that have both a correlation ID and a UUID to just use the UUID instead, or something like that? And we decided to just keep these two concepts completely separate from each other. So there will be many data elements in the demographic data set that they can occur multiple times. So they will have both a correlation ID and a UUID attribute that is allowed on them. And that allows each of those to just serve their own purpose. The correlation ID can be used when you need to tie custom element data to it. The UUID must be used to uniquely identify that object across time. And we didn't try to mix the two together at all, just keeping those very separate purposes. So that's the distinguishing attributes between a correlation ID and a UUID. And so I'll pause again there and just see if anyone has any questions to help clarify what makes a UUID different from a correlation ID. Or if you have any other questions you've thought of about the correlation ID from what Jen shared, then this is a great time to ask those questions too.
I am watching the chat, or you're welcome to raise your hand and we can unmute you so that you can ask your question as well. All right, well, it sounds like we did such a good job, Josh, that no one has any questions at all. So please know that at any time you're welcome to reach out with questions. You can submit them. There is a QR code up on the screen. You can submit questions to the NEMSIS help desk. If I don't know it, I have Josh as a resource that I can go to and ask for his expert consultant opinion. And I also have a really good IT team here at the TAC that I talk to on a regular basis. Originally, yes, the recording will be available on the YouTube channel. Usually it's posted by the next week at the latest. Within a couple days to the next week, it'll be available. And then as always, if there's any topic or idea that you would like to see in one of our public trainings put on by the NEMSIS TAC, please let us know, submit those ideas. We're always looking for input, trying to find out what you'd like to know more about, so that these public trainings can be useful for you and for everyone else. If you have those questions and concerns, we're sure that somebody else out there also has those questions or concerns. Thank you very much for attending. We appreciate the time that you take to learn more about the NEMSIS standard, the NEMSIS process, and the NEMSIS national database for EMS data. Have a great rest of your day, and please feel free to connect with NEMSIS through all of our social media accounts. Chris Hoffman is our extraordinary social media host, and he does a great job keeping those up to date and putting out interesting information. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.